Today in episode 11, how much outreach can one person give? We'll find out with Jill Meyers. Well, welcome back, as always, to Podcasting on a Plane, where we bring you an inspirational yet still realistic view of aviation from as many viewpoints as possible. Last time, you'll remember, we had a sort of a women in aviation-based episode, and today we're going to continue that theme with a woman named Jill Meyers. And when it comes to outreach in aviation, she's one of the outreachiest people you're ever going to meet. She's even founded an entire Women in Aviation chapter herself. That was the one in Philadelphia. And she's going to tell you all about that and a whole slew of other mentorship and outreach roles that she's been responsible for. But before we talk to Jill, I want to thank some people, and they, of course, are our show supporters. And we have 2 new patrons on Patreon, so let's all welcome at the private pilot level, Steve Andrus and Lance Routson. Welcome, guys. And at the commercial pilot level, thank you, Jeff Riolo from Empower UAV, and to hear all about drones from him, go back and listen to episode number 7. And Brian Nathan Juarez, thank you for being a multi-engine supporter. And last but not least, a shout out to Jeff White from Pacific Coast Flyers. You remember him from episode number 4, and he helped me out with some studio stuff. So thanks, Jeff. And as always, thank all you guys. It really means a lot to me that you're willing to help support the show. And if you find value in the podcast and you want to support the show too, you can do what these awesome guys have done and head over to patreon.com/podcastingonaplane. Or if you want to participate in the show in an interactive way, send me your questions and feedback. Just like ATC, which, believe it or not, is a two-way street, so too is this show. So send me your feedback so others can hear what's on your mind. And while we're on that topic, I'd really love to hear your questions, comments, and concerns about ATC for an upcoming Q&A episode about operational stuff. When I give presentations to pilot groups, the best part of the evening is after we get through the presentation part, and we just open up the floor for Q&A time. Oh yeah, that's when the fun stuff comes out. So send me your questions, and it's going to be a lot of fun. Anyway, let's get to our guest. Again, her name is Jill Meyers, and she has done a ton of stuff in aviation. She's an engineer who's worked on such platforms you may have heard of, such as the US, NATO, and UK Airborne Warning and Control System, AWACS for short, aircraft, Air Force One, the Eclipse 500 Very Light Jet, the F35 Lightning II Joint Strike Fighter, the US Air Force Global Hawk UAS, and 3D robotics and consumer drones. Oh, and she also served in the Air Force. But hey, if that wasn't interesting enough for you, then the really, really interesting thing is that she decided to voluntarily give it all up and take on a role at a nonprofit. Which one? And better yet, why? Well, you're going to have to listen to find out. So let's get to it. All right, so today we're sitting down with Jill Meyers, and I'm going to let her tell you all about what she does, because it's quite a long list of things that she has done and things that she does do now. But first off, Jill, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
All right, so tell us real briefly about what you do right now.
Right now, I am supporting an amazing nonprofit organization full-time called Dreams Soar. And we are an organization all about inspiring the next generation of STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math, and aviation professionals, mostly focusing on young girls, since the population of women in aviation is so low and has been low for a long time. So I've been supporting them pro bono since April on a 24/7 basis. Our founder and pilot, whose name is Shaesta Waiz, has just finished a round-the-world flight, flying solo in a Beechcraft Bonanza to meet kids all over the world and inspire them to follow their own dreams.
So you left your entire career to do this full-time?
I actually left my career. I left a, to be honest, very high-paying job working on the F35 Joint Strike Fighter program. Awesome aircraft, really fun work. But I've been doing mentoring and helping kids with things that they didn't used to call STEM and now do for probably 20 years. So when this opportunity presented itself for me to help Shaesta and this organization full-time, I really didn't have a choice just to leave corporate America and go off and, as Shaesta and I like to say, try to save the world one kid at a time.
Sounds like a plan to me. Nothing wrong with leaving corporate America, that's for sure.
Yes, sir.
Okay, so how did you, and we're going to run through your entire thing here to get to this point. When did aviation bite you? Was it really young?
It was. I was 13 years old, living in actually Phoenix, Arizona, raised in Philadelphia, but we moved to Phoenix when I was 11. My father had a friend at the time who lived north of Boston, flew out of Beverly Airport, and he owned a Cessna 140 tail dragger. And we went there on vacation every summer for about a week, lived right on the coast in a small town called Magnolia. And when I was 13, we went up there and I did two things in one day. Josh was his name, took me on a sailboat, which I wasn't too fond of, and then took me up in his Cessna. And at the age of 13, sitting in that thing, that was it. So we went up for about 45 minutes and landed, and the bug was there. So I went home and we lived biking distance to the Scottsdale Municipal Airport, which was very small back then. And I would ride my bike there on the weekends and hang out and watch the airplanes, offered to help, wash them, whatever I could do at that age. And they laughed at me and said, come back when you're a little older, which I did. So I returned when I was of age, started flight training right about the time I turned 17, actually. And while I was 17 in high school, did obtain my private pilot license many, many, many moons ago.
Cool. And so where did it take you after that?
Well, it was interesting. So I didn't have any role models, which is another reason I do what I do now and why organizations like Dreams Soar are so important to me personally. So I was 17, got my pilot's license, would fly, here and there for fun, and never ever saw a female pilot. And it never struck me that I could be a female pilot. But I knew I wanted to be around airplanes. So a friend of mine had gone to an Air Force recruiting office and was chatting with them and showed me the brochures. And I had started college and I actually left after a semester of not having any direction. So I looked at these brochures and thought, wow, I could join the Air Force and be around airplanes and travel the world and get out of the house. All sounded like good things to do. So I went to the Air Force recruiting office with my pilot's license in hand. And they looked at me and pretty much said, hi, honey, what are you doing here? Women don't fly for us right now, but we have this awesome computer job we would love you to fill. And at the time, I didn't do a lot of research on it. I was a little naive back then. So I really wanted to be in the military, though I really wanted to be in uniform. So I joined the Air Force anyway, thinking that maybe they would let me move into piloting at some point, which never happened. But I did get a pretty awesome job and had a really, really good 8 years in the U.S. Air Force. I was able to work on a lot of ground systems. My specialty was ground radar and communication systems. So I had a couple tours all over the world and supported a lot of really awesome aircraft and handled mission planning, communications, mostly radar control. My primary aircraft I supported was the AWACS, the Airborne Warning and Control System, which I did in Europe. I supported the NATO fleet and just had some really cool jobs. So I did that for 8 years and actually poked my head into trying to get into piloting back then. But the Air Force has a funny thing where they look at the field you're in and the field you want to go into, and whichever one is more in demand of people, that's where they stick you. So computers were actually relatively new, those type of computers back then, and this is the 80s now. So they would never let me cross-train. I tried to get into air traffic control. I tried to get into piloting. They said no every time, so I kind of stopped asking. But they did pay for me to finish my degree, so I got my degree in aerospace engineering along the way through the military, which I'm very grateful for, and got out in the late 80s and then started working at companies where I would build airplanes instead of flying them. So that's kind of how my career took off, so to speak.
Wow. So, okay. So you didn't do a lot of the direct operational control of aircraft or flying them, but you seem to have done pretty much everything in the background.
Yes.
Now, we talked a little bit before this, and you told me that you also got to work on other aircraft such as Air Force One, the Eclipse light jet, and a whole bunch of other stuff, actually, which is really cool. Tell us a little bit more about that.
So I worked on Air Force One actually when I was at Boeing, and what I was able to do on Air Force One and related fleets out of Andrews, which used to be Andrews Air Force Base, now called Joint Base Andrews, was they have a communication systems on board that way back then in the early 2000s was quite novel, this funny thing called live internet. And what I was doing for Boeing actually was working on upgrading Air Force One and all the other blue and white painted aircraft out of Washington, D.C. to upgrade and enable their computer and communication systems to be able to provide them live internet access. And a lot of this came about, to believe it or not, on 9/11. Because when 9/11 happened, there was a lack of communication ability for the White House staff. So they came to Boeing and said, hey, you guys apparently have this awesome system. So we started installing it on that fleet at that time. So that was one of the really cool projects I got to do. And Eclipse Aviation, I was there in phase 1. They're now in phase 2. Eclipse hired me in 2005, and I was able to start a systems engineering organization for them, which was really awesome. I had interviewed for a different position, and they came back and said, hey, we'd love you to start this engineering department for us. So I was able to pull together the integration of the final manufacturing of the aircraft. I was in charge of FAA compliance configuration for the test program. So before they would take any of the 5 test planes off for flight testing, I was the one who made sure with the team that it was all checked off per FAA, because it was an experimental aircraft, obviously, at the time.
Sure.
Eclipse was a really, really fun time. I got to fly the jet once, which was one of the highlights of my career. Obviously, right seat with a very awesome pilot who used to teach at Miramar. So I got to fly it for an hour, which was great because I landed and thought I'll never get in a propeller plane ever again. But it was a great experience to be in a company for the first time in my career, building a brand new genre of jet for the first time. It was a really wonderful experience.
And it probably has a sort of an opposite experience too in the Air Force, where you're working on things that had been around for a long time and making slow improvements. You get to start with a clean sheet and just go.
Yes, definitely.
So how long were you at Eclipse?
I was only at Eclipse for about a year.
Okay.
And I left right before they went under the first time.
Right, sure.
And then they got, repurchased, and then they merged with another company, and now they're struggling a bit, but they're hanging in there right now.
What came after that?
After Eclipse, I moved back to the East Coast and worked on some unmanned vehicles. I worked at Raytheon on one of my favorite airframes called the Global Hawk. Global Hawk is an incredible unmanned air vehicle, actually unmanned air system, as we call it, UAS. UAS implies not only the airframe, but the ground system that controls it. So I got to work on upgrades to the Global Hawk system. At the time, Raytheon owned the contract to manage the entire ground system. So Northrop Grumman builds the aircraft and Raytheon builds the ground station. So we were upgrading the radars to be much better and sharper and be able to see farther. For those of you not familiar with Global Hawk, it is a very, very large unmanned vehicle that flies. The unclassified numbers are roughly 60,000 feet. It can stay up for roughly 1 full day and takes just an enormous amount of imagery of all kinds from all different organizations that send in requests. The Air Force has Global Hawk vehicles, NASA has vehicles, and actually NOAA for weather forecasting, I believe, has a vehicle now. So
Okay.
Very versatile aircraft.
And then was that what you did up until you were done?
No, I worked on my last program I worked on, as I said, was F35.
Okay.
And on that program, I was actually one of the managers in charge of manufacturing of all of the communications, navigation, and what we call identification equipment, the CNI system. And the identification equipment is that all military aircraft have a system called IFF, stands for Identification Friend or Foe. And it's a system that can relatively quickly tell the pilot if a radar blip is a good guy or a bad guy. So I was in charge of production of about 40 pieces of hardware that we shipped to Fort Worth to Lockheed Martin to put on the aircraft. And I did that for about 2 years until I decided to depart corporate America.
Okay. So since then, I'm going to say you are by far the most outreachy person we've had on the show yet. And we're all about to find out why that is. But let's see. So after that, you went into women in aviation. You became active there. And you started a chapter in Philadelphia?
Yes.
Okay. So tell me about that.
So I've been a member of Women in Aviation International, WAI, for 16 years now. WAI is a very large organization. We have over 15,000 active members now worldwide, 110 chapters, I believe. And WAI is a nonprofit also that focuses on networking and career and education opportunities for women in any area of aviation or aerospace, any age, any type of role. You know, we have flight attendants, we have pilots, we have air traffic controllers, we have mechanics, we have photographers, we have people who just like airplanes. It's a very, very welcoming, embracing organization. And I moved back to Philadelphia, my original hometown, in 2012, and I went to change my address with WAI, and there was no chapter in Philly. So I called them, and they asked me to start one, which I did. which was an amazing experience to start one from scratch. And I was able to find almost 20 women fairly quickly, I would say within 6 months, to build up a really amazing chapter. So I ran that chapter for about 2 years, and then the job I was in went bye-bye. So I had to depart Philadelphia for lack of able to find a job in aviation. And the chapter unfortunately folded about a year later. They were unable to keep it going. And then when I moved here, a little bit of a funny story. I've supported the folks at WAI headquarters for quite a few years, so they know me fairly well. And when they found that I was moving here, they called the local San Diego chapter president at the time, who had been in place for 2 years and really honestly didn't want to be in the role. So the chapter was kind of flailing. They luckily kept the paperwork alive to keep it a viable chapter on the books, because it is an official nonprofit as a chapter, separate 501c, subordinate 501c3. So I hadn't even moved here yet, and my phone rang, and it was the chapter president who was begging me to take over as president of San Diego before I even set foot in California. So I very politely said, let me just get there first, please. And I did. So I moved here in 2014 and was elected chapter president later that year. So I was chapter president for almost 3 years of this incredible San Diego chapter. I built it back up from being relatively dormant, and now it's as you well know, it's an extremely active chapter. I was able to really bring in a lot of good folks, not only for the board of directors, but as new members. We started mixing things up a little, some military events, some non-military events, since San Diego County is so large, and we have about 65 members now, I believe. We really tried to move events around throughout the county, because a lot of times people wouldn't come ever to a meeting because it was always at the same place and their commute was bad. So I found that having variety helped a lot, and we've built up a really strong chapter. We try to do a lot of meetings with guest speakers. We try to do really awesome events, and we've had a lot of positive feedback about the growth in the last 3 years.
Absolutely. I mean, I would consider the chapter to be a friend of this podcast. Matter of fact, the very last episode, of course, was Serena and Christina.
Yes.
So tell us a little bit about the transition when you kind of handed the reins over to her and then moved on to the thing that we're about to talk about, I promise.
Wonderful. So volunteering is very interesting. What I have found with both chapters, and I've also been president of other nonprofits in the past, is that it's really easy to find passionate people to join. It's very difficult to find passionate people to volunteer and give up their time for the board, for example. And when Serena Hart moved here and joined our chapter early in the year, the first time I met her, I knew that she was going to be amazing. She was one of the few people with a lot of initiative, a lot of great ideas, who was very open to providing her own time. And as I was getting ready to transition to work on Dreams Soar, and I knew it would be 24/7 because of all the time zones, which we'll talk about, I really needed someone to take over as the president. I wasn't going to put myself up for nomination again the following year, but I really couldn't even do the rest of 2017. So I approached Serena after a chapter meeting one day early this year, and I said, hey, I have an idea I'd like you to think about. There's about 70 members of this chapter. You're the only one, I believe, can transition into this role that I need to leave. And she was completely floored. With tears in her eyes, she just said, oh my gosh, let me think about it. So she did, and we talked a few more times. And initially, I'd asked her to think about taking over later in the year. And then when I had to really just jump, I called her one day and said, I kind of need you to do it now. And I convinced her that I would mentor her as much as I could. I would be there right behind the curtains to help her out. And she agreed to do it and is doing an amazing job, especially it's really her first leadership position. And with all the challenges that just come with running a volunteer organization, she's doing a wonderful job. I get a lot of positive feedback. I don't get to all the events right now because of my schedule, but I'm really, really glad that I selected her and that she agreed to fill in the role. And she's really taking the chapter to another level. It's wonderful to watch.
Okay, so after all of that in women in aviation,
yes,
you have decided to take a new step in your professional life. And what is that?
Yes, I did take quite the step. As I mentioned earlier, I am supporting a nonprofit organization full-time called Dreams Soar. And our founder, who I mentioned also earlier, Shaesta Waiz. What's special about Shaesta and our organization is that she was actually born in an Afghan refugee camp, and she and her family escaped to the United States when she was very young to escape the Soviet-Afghan war. Her family settled in Northern California in a very, I wouldn't say poor neighborhood, but definitely not an affluent neighborhood. And Shaesta was raised in a family of herself and 5 sisters in a very intense Afghan culture at home, would go to school and obviously be speaking English. So English is Shaesta's 3rd language. And she grew up really thinking that her future would comprise of having a big family, as her mother did, her aunts, her grandparents. And she really didn't take school seriously. But when she was 18, she got a gift of a ride in a commercial airliner to visit family across the country. And on that 6-hour flight, basically decided that she might be able to become a pilot. She was very enamored with flight once she got in a plane after being fearful of airplanes and flying her whole childhood. So long story short, Shaesta figured out a way to get herself to Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University in Daytona Beach. She completed her bachelor's and her master's, the first in her family to do so, actually became the first certified female civilian pilot in the history of Afghanistan. No woman had ever obtained a civilian pilot license ever. So she decided while at Embry-Riddle to start something called the Women's Ambassador program, I believe, which is still in place, which helped increase the percentage of women enrolled at Embry-Riddle, but also provided mentorship to those freshmen coming in. So while she was doing that, she decided that she really wanted to figure out a way to inspire young girls all over the world. So she decides to plan this trip to fly around the world. Had quite a few mentors, including other what we call Earth Rounders, who had previously circled the globe, particularly in a Bonanza, because she chose the Beechcraft Bonanza A36 aircraft as her single-engine platform to fly around the world. Shaesta, by the way, is now the youngest woman to ever circumnavigate the globe in a single-engine aircraft upon her landing. So, to make the story a little short, I was looking for something new to do in the spring when I departed the F-35 program and corporate life. And I contacted the Dreams Soar organization, just offering my assistance and connecting them with other women in aviation chapters around the world, because, a lot of what we do in women in aviation is about networking. And I looked at the route that was published online, and I saw that Shaesta was planning to fly to places like Mumbai, India, and Dubai, United Arab Emirates, and Australia, all places with WAI chapters. So I contacted them and said, hey, I can help connect you with these WAI chapters if you're going to be planning outreach events there. And they said, wow, that'd be great. We don't really have any help there. So one thing led to another. And before I knew it, I had 3 roles that really did keep me up 24/7 for 4 months, actually 5 months. My primary role was as the outreach coordinator. So we ended up planning 32 outreach events in 17 locations in 14 countries around the world. And I was the lead for planning all of those events. Shaesta ended up inspiring over 3,000 young girls and boys on this trip. My second role was as the logistics coordinator. So in that capacity, I helped organize and coordinate all of the logistics for the ground efforts and for her flight. So we have a international flight planning partner, Hadid International Services in Dubai, and they did things that I couldn't do, like landing permits, overflight permits, some of the legalities of flying internationally. But once they gave me a contact, or other organizations would give me contacts on the ground, I would plan everything to do with Shaesta as a person or the Bonanza as an aircraft once it landed in a certain location. So I would handle scheduling of the refueling, any maintenance that had to occur, refilling her oxygen tanks, for example, because it's a naturally aspirated cabin, and anything over 10,000 feet, Shaesta had to have oxygen on. And then it also included hotels and, pretty much everything Shaesta needed. And then my third role was, if you're familiar with NASA at all, there's a role called CAPCOM, Capsule Commander. And what Capcom does at NASA is, when the space shuttle was up, for example, or even the space station now, There's only one person in flight control who's allowed to talk to the crew, and all the other people, all the other support organizations feed messages to that person. So I was pretty much Shaesta's Capcom. We decided that flying around the world is such an effort in itself and so intense. Pile on top of that all the outreach events, the worldwide media. Shaesta was interviewed along the route by everyone from local TV stations to CNN World News. So I organized all of that and was the funnel for all communications to and from Shaesta, really. So it was a pretty busy time. I was working in multiple time zones pretty much every day. I had to be awake when Shaesta was up. I had to be there monitoring all of her flights. And meanwhile, I had outreach events being planned in time zones, 4 or 5 hours off of that. So I got a couple of hours sleep here and there when I could for pretty much the whole 5 months. And it was an amazing journey. Shaesta landed back in Daytona Beach International Airport on October 4th. Ended up totaling, the flight statistics are 24,816 nautical miles, 176 hours of flight time, 145 days end to end. We had several weather delays that extended the whole trip longer than we had anticipated. But again, the most important thing really isn't Shaesta Waiz flying around the world. The most important thing is that she stood up in front of 3,000 kids and said, I came from a refugee camp. I didn't have wealth and I didn't have good grades, but I set my mind to do something and I worked really hard at it. And you can also all follow your dreams. So that's really the crux of our organization and the mission that we have. Our next push, now that Shaesta is back and resting in an undisclosed location far away, is we really want to empower all these young kids that we've inspired. So we are building up a scholarship program now to be able to offer scholarships of all different shapes and sizes to these young kids to really enable them to let their own dreams soar.
Wow, what an incredible journey. So can I ask you some technical questions about this?
You may.
Were you able to reach her directly at all times when she was flying, like through a sat phone or something, or was she off the grid at times?
We actually were able to communicate. Shaesta carried satellite phones with her, but honestly, we had trouble using them just because of the noise in the cockpit, to be honest. The way that I was able to communicate with Shaesta is Honeywell had donated a system to us to put on the aircraft called AeroWave. And one of the many features of AeroWave is that it actually produces Wi-Fi and internet in the cabin. So with that, there was a private messaging system that I could access. So Shaesta and I were able to exchange text messages while she flew, which really came in handy because there were often times when the specifics of where she needed to go when she landed at a given international airport changed while she was flying. Or she would send me a note and say, hey, I just used up my primary oxygen tank. Can you please arrange for it to be refilled when I land? Because maybe she hadn't planned on being at 10,000 feet for that flight, but had to increase her altitude due to weather. So we really did communicate mostly what I'll call mission critical kinds of things. And on the really long flights, like her last long leg, I should say, was from Hawaii to Oakland area, California, to Hayward Executive Airport. That Pacific Ocean crossing was 2,100 nautical miles, 14 and a half hours of nonstop flying, obviously nowhere to land. So Shaesta and I did communicate periodically just so I made sure she was doing okay during that very long flight, actually record-setting flight leg. So
Sure. And what record was set on that flight?
The actual record that was set, which we're still doing the paperwork with an organization in DC called NAA, it's the actual traveling at a quote record speed of the flight from Honolulu to Hayward. And it's just a matter of filing the correct paperwork to have that logged.
Sure. And now why choose the Bonanza as the aircraft to do this in?
Shaesta did a lot of intense studying as actually part of her graduate program at Embry-Riddle. We have had a lot of people question the selection of a single engine, but I don't have a lot of the technical answers to that. However, I do know from talking to Shaesta that the Bonanza just had the range with the added tanks and the stability and the sturdiness to be able to sustain the mission. The tanks we added, by the way, the Bonanza normally holds roughly 80 gallons of fuel, 40 in each wing. We added tip tanks, DeShannon tip tanks, which gave another 40 gallons total. And then 5 of the 6 seats were removed from the Bonanza, and we installed 2 additional fuel tanks inside. The one that was forward that really took up about half the space of the passenger seat was a 60-gallon tank, and the one behind it, taking up a lot of the space in the back, was a 125-gallon tank. So that gave her full capacity of 300 gallons. And when she did cross the Pacific, she was almost to the full 300 when she took off from Honolulu.
Wow. Now tell me, were there any major issues or anything that you had to overcome during the whole trip?
You know, we shockingly had very few issues other than weather. We did have 3 weather delays. The first was Shaesta was in Canada for much longer than anyone hoped. It was the middle to end of May, and shockingly, still a lot of really cold weather, very low visibility. She was trying to get from Montreal to St. John's, Canada, and waited so long to do that, she finally said, heck with it, I'm going to go to Halifax and wait in Halifax. It's part way. Waited in Halifax, eventually got to St. John's, and then launched from there. Her Atlantic crossing was St. John's, Canada to Santa Maria Island in the Azores, owned by Portugal, and then on to Madrid. The second major weather issue was we were in Dubai for quite a while waiting for the monsoons in the India area to end, which of course they never did. It's the season. It's not like a storm. It's monsoon season. So Universal Weather, a huge supporter of ours doing weather for us, basically said, if you wait for the monsoons, you'll be there for months. So let's do a new route. So we had to reroute Shaesta to fly much further south to basically arc from Dubai down to Singapore. And the third weather delay was really a surprise to everyone, even the meteorologists. Shaesta was in Honolulu and was expected to be there just a few days. And we ended up having to wait almost 2 weeks for headwinds to stop. This was during Hurricane Irma, so I'm not a meteorologist. I don't know if the two oceans' weather patterns are related, but a lot of people would call me and say, you know, there's normally a 24 knot tailwind going easterly, like what the heck are you all waiting for? And we said, well, because the wind component averaged over a 14 to 15 hour flight is a 12 knot headwind, and we can't do that. Even with the 300 gallons, we just couldn't make it. So we had longer wait for the Pacific crossing than we hoped. And we really only had one aircraft issue the entire time, which was quite nice that we only had one. And it was basically when Shaesta first tried to depart Canada, the HF antenna connector came off the wing, and she had to turn around, basically go back to, she ended up landing at an airport called St. Pierre, which is actually French-owned territory off of Newfoundland, and had to have the HF antenna basically put back on. So that kind of came off and was swinging in the wind, which was not a good thing. Other than that, the aircraft held up phenomenally well. Shaesta had no illness the whole time with all those time zones and all the different foods that she ate. I'm really surprised she really did not have one sick day. So it was actually a much smoother ride end to end than anyone really expected for someone flying solo around the world.
Now, if I wanted to follow along, I realize the journey's already long since over, but if I wanted to follow along with her travels, is there anywhere that I could go to do that?
Yes, absolutely. Our website is dreamsoar.org. And in addition to that, we are very heavy on social media. We have I believe I mentioned this earlier, but we have a group of people inside Dreams Soar called the Dream Team. Maybe I didn't mention them. The Dream Team are a group of 20 or 25 young college students from Embry-Riddle. Some have recently graduated or are grad students or are undergrad. And they're just an extremely bright, passionate group of young people, and they're very much running our social media campaigns. So we can be found on Facebook, on Twitter, on Instagram, and on LinkedIn. We also have a YouTube channel. You just go to YouTube and just look for Dreams Soar and click on videos. You'll see a lot of videos that our media producer, Michael Wilds in Florida, another young Embry-Riddle student who's phenomenally talented, also a CFI, just recently blessed CFI. Michael does a lot of our videos, so you'll see some videos that Michael's produced. You also will see some excerpts of her outreach events all over the world. We don't have a lot, but we do have some, and you can find us in any of those places.
Now, I heard that there is a blog that you did during this entire thing that you were writing, and it's on, what's the website, Fly Girls?
Yes. I am also associated with a wonderful project called Fly Girls, the series. The website is flygirlstheseries.com. The Fly Girls project is a miniseries in development, a TV miniseries in development about the World War II women air service pilots, the WASP. And two women in the LA area, the creator of Fly Girls, a Oscar-nominated director, an amazing woman named Mattia Carell is the creator of Fly Girls, and Hilary Prentice is the producer. I've been working with the two of them for over 2 years now as an ambassador for that project. And the connection is that I had lunch with Mattia in August, and she knew that I was supporting Shaesta and Dreams Soar. And we met for lunch, and she was very enamored by my role on Dreams Soar and how Shaesta's universe and mine collided earlier this year. Two people you wouldn't really look at from afar and think that we had anything to do with each other. And she asked me to start a blog on their Fly Girls website. So Shaesta was about halfway around the world at that point. So I started in late August and did a weekly blog every Sunday talking about my role in the organization, the things I dealt with in helping Shaesta, some of my challenges, some of the amazing times that occurred during the mission. It's actually called Helping Dreams Soar. And it was really wonderful because a lot of people didn't really have access to the behind the scenes kind of activity and really wanted desperately to understand what it's like to plan and execute a flight around the world. So, for example, I had a whole episode I'm very proud of acknowledging the Universal Weather team in Houston. So Universal Weather, as I think I mentioned, did our meteorology and weather forecasting for us. But what really shocked me is during the hurricane that they were getting slammed on directly, that was during Shaesta's flying. So there was one particular day, I forget which flight leg Shaesta was doing, but it was a long flight leg in Southeast Asia. And one of the people that was online with us doing weather was literally stuck at work while her husband was trying to keep their home from floating away. In the middle of the hurricane, they still said, no, we are here to help you. We are here for you 100%. We are so passionate about what Shaesta and Dreams Soar is doing. And, if the house falls apart, so be it. And that kind of dedication was mind-blowing to me. And it was really important for me to write about it and acknowledge those kinds of extremely altruistic people and organizations that went to really all extremes. Oh, by the way, all on their own time, none of it paid, to really support our effort to inspire the next generation.
Well, it sounds like this was an incredible journey. And actually, I can't wait to start catching up on that blog. Sounds like there's a lot of great stuff in there. Mm-hmm. If people are interested in getting in touch with you, how can they do that?
I can be reached best by email, which is jill.meyers, jill.meyers @dreamsoar.org.
Wow. They say it takes a village to raise a child, and I'd say that that's right on the money. But the lesser known fact is that it also takes a village to get a flight from point A to point B. And it takes a really talented village to get someone solo around the world in a Bonanza. All of that planning and information from all of those team members eventually goes through one last person. And I tell you what, if I was out over the Atlantic Ocean by myself, I'd be happy to know that Jill was that person. So while you wait for the Fly Girls mini-series to air, go check out Jill's blog on the Fly Girls website to learn more about what it took to keep Shaesta and Dreams Soar in the air. There's a link, of course, in the show notes. I want to thank Jill for taking the time out of her very busy life to sit down with me and share her worldview. If you're interested in getting in touch with Jill, she gave her info, but I'll put it in the show notes as well. And if you want to get in touch with me, head on over to podcastingonaplane.com where you can email me directly and follow the show on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. One of my favorite parts of making the show is hearing stories from you out there in Airworld. And if you want to share something, send it on in. Well, that's all for now. Your frequency change is approved until next time, and report back on this frequency for the next episode. Good day. The Podcasting on a Plane podcast is presented for entertainment purposes only. My comments and those of my guests, the website's content, and any of the social media, etc. are not part of my official responsibility as a controller or an FAA employee. The views and opinions you hear on the podcast are mine and those of my guests, and not necessarily that of the FAA. There is no nexus between Podcasting on a Plane and the FAA. Also, while I am a CFI, I'm not your CFI. Nor am I your mechanic, your doctor, your shrink, or your spouse. This podcast is presented for entertainment, camaraderie, and fun, but is in no way, shape, or form professional advice. It's not legal counsel, and it's definitely not flight instruction. If you are in need of professional advice, get some from somewhere more appropriate than a podcast, no matter how good this one may be.